Hello, everyone. This is our second interview for the Colorado Musical Festival 2023. Apologies that you only have my voice and a picture. Having a few technical difficulties this morning, but we are so excited to have Donald with us this morning. Why don't you go ahead and start with telling us a little bit about yourself?
All right. My name is Donald Loftus. I'm a playwright and lyricist living in New York City. And prior to playwright, I've always been a playwright. I was in seventh grade. My best friend was Mark O'Donnell, who ended up writing Hairspray. So,
Oh
and
my gosh.
we wrote plays all the way through high school together. And then he went to Harvard, and I didn't. And then he came back and he wrote Hairspray, and I didn't. So I instead followed a business career. I was the president of a number of pretty famous cosmetic companies in America that had we had brands like Gucci and Dolce and Gabbana and Yves Saint Laurent and Escada and Burberry and a number of others. I worked for several companies, and each one then got sold to the next company. And fortunately, I got to move on as president of that company as well. So I had a long career in that, and all while I was doing that, I was writing plays. I would wake up at 4 in the morning and work from 4 till 7 every day on playwriting, and then I would go to work and do my job. And now I retired like 5 years ago, and I've been sort of cleaning up the plays and sending them out. And I've had like shock for me. It's been a real shock at how the acceptance I've had. And so my plays have been seen across America and in England, and there was even a production in Sweden and one in India. So it's all been pretty fun.
That's
And
awesome.
I've written a number of full length plays, but I've also written four musicals, one of which I'm thrilled that you're working on with me for your festival, called Illusion. I write the book and lyrics, someone else writes the music. My composer, his name is Steve Zackham. He's a wonderful composer, and good for him and bad for us today. He's the musical director on the Queen Mary, the ship. So he's out on the ocean somewhere. It's probably like 3 o'clock in the morning for him somewhere
Nice.
where he's at. But
No worries.
we wrote the play through COVID, oftentimes while he was on the ocean, and we wrote it a lot online together using Zoom and whatever, and uh, and that's that. That's
That's
where we're at.
awesome. Wow. No, I love that. That's so great.
Good.
Well, tell us a little bit about your show and what it's about and all that good stuff.
So our play is it's called Illusion, and it's a musical, it's kind of a show business musical in the tradition of Gypsy or Funny Girl, about a man named Julian L. Tinge. And what's so amazing about this for me is that here's a guy who conquered vaudeville, conquered burlesque, conquered Europe. He was on a European tour, went to Broadway, was so successful on Broadway, they actually named a theater after him. There was a Julian L. Tinge Theater.
Wow.
Then he went to Hollywood and had huge success, and yet today nobody knows his name.
Right.
And it's funny because we started writing this show about 4 years ago, I guess. And what's happened in the world, and particularly in America, um, with cancel culture and gay bashing and drag queen bashing, Julian L. Tinge became this huge legendary star, playing women's roles. A man playing women's roles dressed as a woman. But it wasn't like drag queens. It wasn't like RuPaul is today. It was an art form. It had been done, obviously since Shakespeare times and even before, where the female roles were played by women, and Julian Eltinge continued that tradition. And through the 20s and 30s and 40s, uh, actually through 1910 through early 30s, I should say, he was hugely popular, and women were fascinated by him. Like, you're just like sort of in awe at his performance. A lot of men were sort of creeped out by it, frankly, but women loved it. But what happened was, so he has this huge success. As I said, there was a theater named after him. That theater today, by the way, is the AMC Multiplex Movie Theater, which has been lifted up from 42nd and Broadway, and moved. The whole theater was lifted up and moved to 8th Avenue to become the AMC movie theater. And when you enter that theater today and you look up, there's an arch ceiling, and there are these muses painted on this arch in the ceiling. Those are Julian L. Tinge dressed as a woman, you know,
Oh, how
and
cool.
you know, hundreds and hundreds of people go to this theater every week. Most people have no idea and have never heard of Julian L. Tinge. What happened to him was so he's at the peak of his career. He moves to Hollywood, and there was a very famous rape murder by an actor named Fatty Arbuckle was accused of the murder of a woman, a young starlet, if you will, at the time, over a Labor Day weekend party. And he was eventually found not guilty, but Hollywood was wild back then. And there were lots of suicides and lots of drug overdoses and murders and everything else. And finally, religious groups and women's groups and so on, political groups came down very, very hard on Hollywood and put into place what's called the code. And suddenly it became illegal for there to be a movie with a man and woman, husband and wife, even in the same bed. They had to be in twin beds. If you remember, I Love Lucy was part of that
Right.
situation. And homosexuality was already illegal at that time. This was in the early 20s. It also became illegal for a man to dress as a woman, which is how he made his entire career.
Right.
So his career was over, and so that's sort of the biographical part of our musical, and
Hmm.
it follows his career very much like Funny Girl or Gypsy did for those two people. The underlying thing is that the play starts out when he's a young boy of 9 years old living in Boston. He has an Irish immigrant father who's an alcoholic and also a homophobe and sort of abusive. And Julian L. Tinge, even as a 9 year old, knew he was gay.
Right.
And the father, freaks out about this. He's blaming the intellectuals of Boston, which is where they live,
Hmm.
for causing his son to be this way. So he packs the family up and moves them to Butte, Montana.
Oh my.
And Butte at the time was they're having a copper rush. It was like the gold rush, I guess, but for copper. And so suddenly Butte became this, like, from this little nothing, became this fairly important town west of the Mississippi, and everyone moved there. And so Dad moved there and opened a barber shop and so on and so forth. The Julian, and now this next part we just made up. This is just our addition to the plot. So
Uh-huh.
Julian, a young gay teenager, falls in love with a high school football star, and the two of them have a relationship. And Dad finds out, and the two of them are actually performing at a bar, and Dad finds out about it and goes nuts and ends up in jail because he actually tries to shoot him, and then Mom sends Julian back to Boston by himself, and that's really when his career starts. But it's through the whole thing, the real Julian L. Tinge, because the homosexuality thing was, well, first of all, it was illegal at the time, but it was also just something that they were deep in the closet about. He would do things like he'd stage bar fights. He would hire an actor to pretend that he was having a bar fight with him, to prove that he was a man's man, and he would schedule wrestling matches, which were also fixed, which he would always win. Again, to prove that he was a man's man, and so the whole thing is just sort of sad. And
Yeah.
and when we look at what's going on right now, particularly in the state of Florida, and and what the LGBTQ community is going through today,
Right.
I I think this play is helpful because, and it wasn't intended to be at the time we started writing it. I was just sort of fascinated with this story about a man that was so famous that today nobody knows. Now it's become much more relevant as all this stuff has happened in our country regarding LGBTQ and particularly drag queens, and what's going on there. So I think it's hopefully, and we've actually written the ending so it's a little bit uh, more positive, so that
Hmm.
young gay people today might say, "Wow, this I'm not the first one. This has happened to others before me," and so and so, and sort of face up to it and fight against it, kind of thing. So it's actually what started as sort of a, for us, a fun, interesting story has become much more of a an important, message, I think, for the world on what's going on.
Oh, totally. Well, and it's one of those things where there are historical figures that were queer and we just don't ever see their stories. We don't
Right,
ever hear about them, and so people don't think that trans people or queer people or gay men or drag queens for that matter existed, and it's like,
right.
no,
This is
they
not new.
did. Yeah.
Centuries. Yeah.
Right. No, that's wonderful. So I mean, we touched on this a little bit, but how, why, like the why of your show, and like how this is an untold story, or maybe how you discovered this story and started the process. If you wanted to talk a little bit about that
Yes.
piece.
Well, it's funny because it really was very strange how it started. So we live in my wife and I live in Manhattan, and we go to this multiplex theater. They have like, I don't know, 14 theaters on several floors. It was this
Mm-hmm.
huge, and we go in there, and I had no idea that the building had been moved or any of this stuff. And I go in, and I just happen to look up and see this incredible archway. And I'm like, that's really interesting. And that some guy saw me looking. He goes, "Do you know who that is?" I go, "I have no idea." He goes, "That's Julian Eltinge." I go, "Really? It looks like a woman. Who's Julian Eltinge?" And then
Yeah.
they said this theater used to be the Julian Eltinge. They picked up. So I went home that night, and sure enough, on YouTube, and your watchers can watch it too. It's on YouTube, and you actually see the Julian Eltinge Theater being picked up off the ground and moved on rails to this other avenue,
Wow.
uh, this AMC theater. Why they went through that expense, I don't know, because very few people even probably even notice it. It's not the whole theater; it's just the entrance of the theater, and then they built the high rise, on top
Around
of
it,
it.
yeah.
But it's so that's sort of like how I discovered it. So then I just started doing research, and the more I read about them, the more fascinated I was about how is it possible, and I was thinking that perhaps we wouldn't know Fanny Bryce, if it wasn't for Funny Girl, or perhaps we wouldn't know Gypsy Rose Lee if it weren't for Gypsy. I don't know, but
Right.
it's just. I mean, there's a new television show that about generations and how somebody said, "Wait, Paul McCartney was in a band before Wings." They so that does happen from generation to generation. Um, but I do think I do think it's important that we learn this stuff and really sort of understand that history. Plus, I've always been like a theater freak and a theater nerd. So the whole to watch him go very much like Fanny Bryce, but to watch him go from vaudeville, or actually burlesque to vaudeville to theater,
Yeah.
and how the career moved. And he was his first Broadway show that he was in super Broadway shows. His first one was when he was 20 years old, and
Wow.
he was the star of that. And then they had several after that. And it's funny because the whole, I mean, other than Travels with My Aunt or Charlie's Aunt, I mean, there are very few plays that get revived that have a man dressed as a woman.
Right.
It's pretty unusual, and yet he had several at the time, and I think they were probably written for him because that was his talent, and as I say, people were fascinated. The King of England actually, like, when he toured Italy, he toured France, and he went to England. The king actually saw him and greeted him and gave him a puppy. He liked him so much. So yeah, he was big time, and his end. There's videos of him at the end of his life. As when the Hollywood thing happened, he died at age 59 in
Hmm.
1941. But the Virginia Rapé thing was 20 years earlier than that, and that was pretty much the end of his career. The 20s were rough for him after that because he was in the movie with Virginia Rapé. I forgot to mention that. So he was at this party and he was in the movie with Virginia Rapé and Fatty Arbuckle, and then she gets, allegedly murdered by Fatty Arbuckle. Turns out he was found not guilty in the end, but
Hmm.
it didn't stop, ending Julian's career. And then he struggled for the next several years, and it was actually he finally moved back to New York, and he finally got a job. He was nearly penniless. By the way, he was so wealthy that the Steven Spielberg's house in Hollywood, which is on the top of a Hollywood hill,
Mm-hmm.
its largest mansion in Hollywood. That was Julian Eltinge. He built that mansion.
Oh
That was his.
wow.
That's how successful he was. He made more money than Charlie Chaplin at the time. So
Dang.
for him to be that rich and to crash that far to that at the end of his life, he was, as I say, nearly penniless. And Fanny Brice's husband owned a nightclub in New York, and it just out of he had really he was well past his prime. He didn't really have much going on, but out of friendship, she got him a gig there, which is where the show opens. It actually opens at the end of his career and at the end of his life,
Oh, cool.
uh,
Yeah.
where he's working there, and then we flash back to his childhood.
Nice. Yeah, no, that's really cool. I love that. Um, Next question I've got for you is why should folks come see our showcase performances, particularly with the portion of the show we've selected from your piece?
I think what you guys are doing is so exciting. Steve, my composer, and I were absolutely thrilled to have been selected. I love the idea. I love the whole concept of what you're doing.
Thank
I
you.
think it's really, really important. I mean, as I say, I'm a theater nerd, so I see everything. Throughout my entire business career, I would see, I would advertise in Playbill just to get invited to the shows. I would see everything. And so I saw a lot of stuff. There's a lot of great theater. There's a lot of great theater by unknowns, and it's hard. I mean, it's hard to get your work on a stage. So the work that you're doing is hugely beneficial to writers and composers and lyricists to just get their work staged, just see if it even works. I mean, it's so important. Until you see it in front of a live audience, you have no real idea if it has any merit or not. And there are many times where I've gone. I just went this past weekend to a theater in Cincinnati. Had done one of my dramas and a non-musical, and it was really really interesting to hear the audience feedback.
Yeah.
And I learned a lot. And I'm going to make adjustments to the script as a result of it. I mean, it really teaches you a lot, and
Mm-hmm.
it also helps us as we like after we do your festival this fall. We're doing an equity staged reading in New York for producers.
Oh
So
wow.
we're going to learn from what you guys are doing, and then it actually I've taken some producer master classes. There's an organization that offers those, and one of the things we learned there is by us saying that we're in this Colorado festival, we're also in a New York festival in November. That that gets producers interested because it makes them think, well, it must be something here because these organizations have chosen this work, so it's worth a look at, kind of thing.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
really, I mean, there are thousands of playwrights and composers in New York. I'm sorry, in America, that we're competing against. So, as I say, the work you're doing it helps. Hopefully it's entertaining for the audience, and they have a good time seeing something new, and then maybe hopefully watching some of it go on further. But it's also helpful to the creators to edit their work, get feedback, and so on. You sent me some feedback today on what's been said so far. It's really hugely helpful,
That's
and
awesome.
it will help us get it hopefully to its final stage, which is Broadway someday.
Right? Broadway bound, man. That's one of the tags we use on all our social media.
Broadway baby. Yep.
I love that. Well, and you said your next step is pretty. I mean, the next question is like, what are your show's next steps? But
Yeah.
so you said you're doing an equity reading for producers in New York in the fall. Like
Yeah.
that's super cool.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about like I honestly me as somebody who's involved in this festival and also a composer, like how did you get to that step? Like how like
Well,
or what does that look like? I'm curious.
Well, we sent. I sent. I'm very aggressive about submitting my plays to you and to other opportunities across the country
For
as they
sure.
come up. One of the things that we submitted to, which I was very excited about, what there's a new catalog put together by there's a group of university leaders from various universities and colleges, and they put together a musical theater catalog of new work.
Oh
And
wow.
you have to submit it, and you have to send them your whole score and your script and the whole thing. and they choose, I think they chose like 8 or 10 of them, which are now in their catalog, and they offer them up to colleges and universities across the country and also the UK. That's great for us because if that gets chosen by any of those colleges have money to do
Yeah.
sizable productions and so on and so forth. So that's also a step. We're in
What
a
what organization is that?
It's the American Association of Educators. I'll get
Okay.
you the name. It's something like that. It's the
That's
AA
great. Cool.
education, and with our musical just went into their catalog in June. It
Wow.
just that was this year's catalog started in June, and I guess it's like an electronic catalog because they have MP3s of the
Yeah.
music and so forth. So it's pretty cool. Um, so there's that going on. We also entered into a festival in New York, which will be in November, and then I'm on the board of the Dramatist Foundation. So I mean, I'm really fortunate because I have a lot of friends like Andrew Lippa, who wrote the Addams Family
Oh
musical,
wow, yeah.
Doug Wright, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning playwright. They're all on the board with me, and so they're my friends,
Right.
and so it doesn't hurt a bit.
Not at
And
all.
so I've invited. So we're playing this equity stage reading. I found a wonderful director that's worked with Stephen Schwartz. He's a Brazilian American. He directed the first production of Pippin in Brazil
Oh, how cool.
with Stephen Schwartz. So and it's worth it just to have Stephen Schwartz in the audience. All this stuff helps. So and he's a very talented director. So he will do this for us. We'll do three. Your equity allows you to do three performances of it. They'll be on book. It's not a full production, but it's if it's well done, and I've done them in the past. If it's well done, the audience will think they saw costumes and sets, and if your actors are great,
Oh, for sure.
uh, it's you feel like you've been there. You feel like you saw the musical.
Definitely.
So and we invite producers to that, and that's really the next step. It's learning from what you're doing, learning from these other productions that we're doing, and cleaning up. We clean it up every single day, and then that one we invite producers, and then hopefully somebody picks it up, and then it's their project, and we get to relax a little bit.
Yeah.
But that's the goal. That's the hope.
That's awesome. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that with
Yeah.
me and with our audience. I appreciate that. Um, my next question. I've got two more for you. Why should Colorado Theater produce your show following this workshop process? So why should Colorado producers pick you up?
Well, I think because of what's going on in the country. I mean, I think it's a good show. If what was going on in the country didn't happen, I think it's a fascinating story.
Hmm.
And I do think most people who've read it very much like the comments that you sent me from your readers, or your literary group, whatever I forget what you call them, but
The
um,
adjudicators, yeah. Hmm.
yeah, it's an interesting story of somebody they've never heard of, and so you're sort of like, wow, how is it possible? So I think from that standpoint, the Colorado Theater should do it. I also think that I think music. One of the things that Stephen did in the music, we span a long period of time. We've spanned, from 1890 to 1940. So when you think about the music of those decades, it
Hmm.
changed quite a bit. And Stephen, who he's a very, very talented musician. He studied at Berklee College of Music in Boston. He's super talented. Musical director of the Queen Mary. It's
Right.
pretty big. So he's a huge jazz aficionado.
Love
So he
that.
was very, very careful to make sure that whatever decade was on stage at that moment in Act One, Scene One, uh, through the entire play, that the music sounded like it belonged to that year. Which is I think is sort of also sort of interesting to the audience, and it should feel authentic.
Hmm.
It should feel like they're hearing. Um, Music that might have been on the Broadway stage in 1926 or whatever it might be,
Yeah.
um, which I think is kind of fun too. And then, like I say, I think hopefully when they leave the theater, so hopefully, I guess for present it because I think it's good entertainment, and hopefully, and they'll enjoy a story that they hadn't heard before. Um, the After they leave the theater, Hal Prince one time said, when I leave the theater, I want to be a different person than I was when I walked in the door.
Yeah.
That's great theater, and I love that because if you leave the theater and your mind's been changed, or you thought, wow, I never thought about that way, or what people are going through who are facing these same things. I mean, one of the challenges that we've had as creators, as I sent it out, I've gotten twice now. Theaters have written to me and said, "Are you or your composer, are either one of you gay?"
Yeah.
And I said, "No, actually, we're both married." And they're like, "Well, we're not really sure that you have a right to write this." And I'm like, "Okay, well, first of all, it's a historical character. It's a real person. Secondly, we're in the theater. We've been friends and have loved LGBTQ people our whole lives, and that was in the cosmetic industry. So
Right.
none of this is new to me. I did tell my composer he may have to take one for the team and say he's gay. No, I'm just kidding. But that's one of the challenges that we'll have, and I think that's something that's going on in the theater today. There's a huge trend towards, like, if you're not of that group, you have no business writing that thing.
Yeah.
I think that it should all be viewed blindly. I don't think the audience has a clue who, even like the big show. I don't think they know who wrote Dear Evan Hansen, and whether they're women, men, gay, straight, whatever. I don't think that should play a part in it. The theater piece, I think, has to stand by itself on the stage and do its job.
Right.
And hopefully this will.
Right. Well, and it's I mean, in my grad school, I finished grad school for theater last year,
Congratulations.
and one of the things we talked about a lot was basically, yeah, who has the right to tell stories and even direct things that aren't of their life experience. And I think one of
Right,
the common denominators that we all discussed was that, if you are involving the people who that impacts in the process,
right,
then you're giving voice and giving platform and the giving space to these creators. Like, I think it's perfectly valid to write a play about a gay man and then say, "Hey, I want I want a drag star to, be a part of it. I want them to direct it. I
right.
want them to, be a part of the creative process and to listen to those voices." Um, and that's, yeah, no, it's definitely I think something that we're reckoning with is that
Yeah,
how
for
do
sure.
we, because there's always the, like, men writing women is like a joke on, there's like a whole like Reddit on like bad men writing women.
Oh yeah,
And so I think, but I do also think like Steel Magnolias was written by a man and based on real women in his life, and it's a beautiful piece for six women. Like, and so we wouldn't have pieces like that if it weren't for
look
a
at
man
Shakespeare. I
writing
mean,
it, right?
Lady Macbeth.
Yeah. Oh
Wonderful.
yeah, no, she's incredible. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, anyway, so that was a digression, but love that.
The guy who's, well, I can't say his name yet, but he's fairly famous. The guy who's scheduled to play our lead in the equity production,
Yeah.
um, has played a woman on Broadway. He does drag shows regularly, although he also plays straight roles in straight being non-female
Yeah.
roles in other plays. But he's made a career of this, and when we sent him the script, he said, "Oh my God, I've always wanted to play Julian L. Tinge." We're like, "Wait a minute, you've heard of him?" He's like, "Yes." He said, "I based much of my original act on him." So
I
he's
love that.
perfect for us. Yeah, he's really super talented.
Our like director person for the festival um is trans and a drag performer, and if they were not going to grad school in Chicago, literally moving the weekend of the festival, I was like, this role was made
Be
for you
perfect.
and it'd be
Yeah,
fabulous and you would kill it. But alas, they're leaving for Chicago, but they're excited to
let
be a
them do
part
it in
of it and
Chicago.
to direct it. And
Tell them they can do it in Chicago for us.
there you
Yeah, I
go. They
think
can bring it to Chicago. I love that.
there's
Um,
one very famous person that a friend of mine just sent me and said that he's very interested in the role. Unfortunately, he's 80. And
Oh,
Joel Tinch died when he was, I think, 59.
oh wow.
So,
Yeah.
as great as that would be, it's not going to work from an age standpoint. So,
But it would be lovely to see an older actor get to do that. Like that would bring
yeah,
me
yeah,
great joy. I
yeah.
always appreciate that. Well, the last question I have for you, and thank you so much for giving of your time and your talents and sharing your work with us. The last question I have for you is, what other shows in the festival are you looking forward to seeing more from what you've maybe seen or read or heard about?
The I saw a bit of the family drama, which I think sounds very interesting. I came to the first rehearsal that
Yeah.
was online, and that one looks. I think as it's new and fresh. They all are. I mean, I think your
Yeah.
selection of what you're presenting is very diverse, and really interesting. It's not typical of stage musicals. That's for sure.
Yeah,
And,
definitely.
so yeah, I'm actually looking forward to all of them.
Thank you. I know I'm so excited as well. I think Problem with the Pattersons is probably the one that you're thinking
Yes,
of. Yes.
you're exactly right.
Yeah, that
You're
one's
exactly
really
right.
fun. I'm excited to to get to know the writer for that one a little bit more, Laura. She's I think it's Laura. Um, I'm really excited for that. But yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much for
Thank you.
joining me today in this slightly unconventional thing. I feel really bad when people can't see my facial expressions. But
Well, photograph.
appreciate
Photograph.
you. All right. Well, thank you so much. And
All right.
for folks listening in, we will have more of these coming up. So stay tuned for more. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much. Take care.